Hi, my name is Alex Safe Cummings. Um, I'm the author of a book called Brain Magnet, Research Triangle Park and the Idea of the Idea Economy. This was recently published by Columbia University Press, and Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky has been very generous in um, letting me and a bunch of other authors talk about what we've recently published. This book started a long time ago. Um, I thought about this as a dissertation project, and I kind of put it aside. But I was always fascinated by Research Triangle Park in North Carolina and the greater metro research triangle as a whole. Raleigh, Durham, Chapel Hill, Cary. I grew up mostly in North Carolina in a rather benighted former textile town called Gastonia. And the triangle was always so interesting because it's where all these universities are. It's where all these like tech companies are, hospitals, medical schools. There's rather more ethnic diversity than other parts of North Carolina. I always thought like, well, how did that come to be? Why is it like that? Um, how did like there was no such thing as a research triangle prior to 1955. It just didn't exist. It's a name that people came up with um, as an economic development project, and it's stuck. Like the triangle is a place now. Like there's triangle falafel, there's triangle yoga, there's triangle sub sandwiches, there's triangle realty, like just anything like that, like any other pro- mm, sort of real estate naming that happens all over the place. But I was interested in this because it was happening in a state that was among the poorest. You would be surprised. In the early 1950s, North Carolina was very close to the bottom of wages and income, etc., levels of education, to rival any of the other states that you might think of in that regard. Um, and there was a plan to change that. And it's like, well, how do you create a Silicon Valley in a place that is Jim Crow, racist, backward, um, undeveloped, no sort of high skill industries really? They did it, and I was always interested in how. I've always been interested in these places that are kind of made up. Like, Washington, D.C. was a city they just decided, like, Washington, D.C. is going to be here. Here's where the nation's capital is. It's going to have a weird shape. This is just like what we've decided to do. Brasilia in Brazil, Islamabad in Pakistan. Those are certain examples of sort of made up places. And I think of Stephen Kotkin's book Magnetic Mountain as well about Magnitogorsk in the Soviet Union. How do people come to a place and sort of decide, like, okay, this is what it is. Here's the name. Here's what it's about. It makes pharmaceuticals, or it makes steel, or whatever, or it's the nation's political center. I was very interested in that, and so that's why I wanted to see like what were they thinking in the 50s and how did this come about? And then what does it have to do with these broader questions about American life in the late 20th century and early 21st century? It was an example of trying to create an information economy out of nothing, essentially. Not nothing, because they had the three universities UNC Chapel Hill, NC State, and Duke, as well as other colleges in the general area. Um, but still, it was like this is not where you would expect something very high tech and very like futuristic to happen. So, what does that have to do with the broader discourse about like what is the new economy? Even in the 1960s, people who were very perceptive recognized that in manufacturing as a part of the certainly as a part of employment on a national scale um, was diminishing. There's automation, there's offshoring. It was clear even in the 60s that like manufacturing as a part of the economy was going to be relatively diminished by others. So some people saw that coming. And there's this whole discussion of the idea of the new economy, the post industrial economy, the information society. Many people wrote about this, people like Daniel Bell, Alain Touraine, Manuel Castells, Saskia Sassen, and so forth. Uh, we recognize that something changed in terms of the political economy in the 70s and 80s. Um, Research Triangle Park, RTP, was part of that, but it was one of the most like sort of case study textbook examples of like what if you just tried to create this out of the box. Like it's a distilled example of that like ideology of like what would it be like if we had a post-industrial economy, what it would be like if people were doing science and research and writing and creating intellectual property as their production as opposed to socks or cars or whatever. What would that look like? Well, you can look at RTP and see this is what a certain group of people, a certain elite group of people in North Carolina thought that looked like. This is the Jetsons economy of the future. This is what we're all going to be doing when there's no manufacturing and we're all just sitting around making intellectual property somehow. It's very much of the age. It's very much of the late 20th century idea that like we could have an economy where we don't make stuff. We just make ideas, expressions, movies, music, patents, technologies, things that are to some degree evanescent or ephemeral. So you look at this, you see sort of the emergence and the evolution of this ideology about like what the future should be like. And it looks a lot like Research Triangle. You've got extremely sprawling cities in Raleigh, Durham. You have Chapel Hill, which is a very quintessential college town, which has a very sort of elite and affluent population relative to its surroundings. You have Cary, which is a city that did technically exist prior to Research Triangle Park, but grew by like 2,000% or something in a short period of time because it was a place where people, scientists, engineers, and so forth who worked in Research Triangle Park were living. Now it's one of the larger cities in North Carolina, and it's a perfect suburban, clean, safe, lovely, boring place for people who make upwards of $100,000 a year to live. Largely white and Asian, although not entirely. But this is the new landscape. This is the idea of what the good life is in the late 20th century as we come into the 21st century. As I'm recording this little video, it seems like maybe this whole political economic paradigm that I'm describing is maybe uh, falling apart and like not going to work anymore. But this is the way that a lot of policymakers, intellectuals, journalists, academics thought about the way the economy should work, what the city of the future should look like, and again, it looks a lot like the Research Triangle. It's sprawling, it's suburban, it's relatively affluent, it's relatively diverse, but it has these grinding inequalities baked into it. You can look at several cities in North Carolina as being at the very bottom of rates of social or economic mobility compared to the Northeast or the West Coast. This class and racial inequality has remained completely in place, even as this high-tech, prosperous economy has developed. And I ask in the book, like, well, did it accomplish racial and economic equality? No, because that was not what it was designed to do at all. It was designed to bring investment and highly educated professionals and their income and their tax revenue to a rather poor underdeveloped state, and it accomplished that. So, like the fact that the cities of North Carolina and North Carolina as a whole remain uh, rather segregated, certainly vastly unequal economically speaking, um, should not be surprising because that's not what this was meant to do. Maybe there was an idea that rising tide will raise all boats, but it just like that's an afterthought. It's like, yeah, all the other boats, who cares? Well, they'll probably rise. I don't know. Um, anyway, I think that the triangle is very interesting. It's interesting because it's boring. Like that's funny, right? Like why did the Lens like study Middletown in Indiana in the 1920s? Not because it was such a fascinating, like, cool place on the cutting edge of anything, but because it was exemplified something. And I think that the Triangle is kind of the same way. It's a sprawling, suburban, kind of boring, nice place to live. Uh, and so maybe that's not interesting in some sense, but it is very indicative of what the priorities of policymakers and a lot of relatively privileged, educated professional workers, the so called creative class that Richard Florida described, what they wanted. And they got it. So there's a happy ending to the story. I really appreciate you guys watching this little clip. I wish you would check out the book potentially, just see what you think of it, and also check out all the other books by the authors who are participating in this history summit and the other authors who are part of Columbia University Press, who have books out now because obviously it's very difficult to bring attention to publications in this rather unusual environment that we're in. Anyway, thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time.